Part 3. How to Fight Zombies. President Ajuma Wakumbu had called upon the army, the police forces, and all the country's civil engineers to construct a perimeter around the capital. Her ministers had enacted a curfew to protect the citizenry who had not yet been infected by the zombie outbreak. But still, the zombies only multiplied. The scourge had begun in the countryside. Reports had come in from far-flung villages of bodies rising up from the grave, wandering about at night, shambling on decomposing limbs and broken bones, barging into huts and homes, drawn inexorably on by the scent of living flesh. A single bite from them would lead to fevers, chills, and a discoloration of skin, followed by a coma and even a death-like state. But that was not the end. The newly bit would transform, their bodies having turned a shade of gray-blue. They would wake, ravenous to feast upon living flesh themselves. With their bodies not yet decayed, these new zombies were faster than their revenant counterparts, called shamblers. Nimble and agile, these newly infected, referred to as runners, presented an even greater menace to the living. Yet, except for their empty white eyes and their discolored flesh, they still resembled the deceased people they had once been, so no one was prepared to hurt or harm them. Some families tried to keep them captive until a cure could be found. But whatever bindings or locked rooms they were confined by, they always escaped, leading to disastrous consequences. The Ministry of Health insisted that this zombie plague was not caused by black magic, but rather a virus. Doctors and scientists were hard at work, day and night, trying to develop a vaccine. The last thing the populace should do was panic. After all, the army, the police, and civil engineers were maintaining the perimeter around the city and its environs. They set up roadblocks of riot shields and electric fences usually reserved for keeping lions and leopards away from farmers' herds of cattle. The nightly news showed officers and soldiers alike standing guard, stoic in their resolve and faithful in their duty. At least, that was what the news reporters said. Even as the hordes of shamblers and runners pressed up against the barriers, the message from one government spokesperson after another was the same. Don't panic. All is under control. And yet, by word of mouth, there were always rumors. Rumors of places where the ministry had been forced to pull the perimeter back. Rumors of runners that had slipped through to be found in someone's basement or in their garden, where the creatures would jump out and attack. The government denied any such breaches, but the sight of Ministry of Health vans and Ministry of Security troop carriers speeding down neighborhood streets to surround a home, then cordon it off with lines of police tape, plastic sheeting, and biohazard signs, told a different story. It did not help matters that President Wakumbu had not been seen or even appeared on camera for weeks, locked away in the State House as she was. She was working to find a solution to the crisis. That was the official word. But rumors flew here too. The president had fled the country on a secret flight to South Africa, or she had even succumbed to the virus herself and was undergoing experimental treatment in Saudi Arabia, or, even worse, she had been bit, and she herself had become a zombie, running rampant in the confines of the presidential compound, her aides doing their best to keep her condition secret. All the while, the number of zombies, shamblers, and runners grew. The news cameras on television and amateur footage on the internet revealed more and more ghastly faces pressing up against the barriers, clawing up walls, struggling to squeeze through fences, even as more filled every street and lane and feeder road to the horizon. Don't panic. All is under control. These remained the official words from every government ministry. It was the message from guards stationed at border crossings into the neighboring countries, even as they locked down the gates and pointed their weapons at anyone who tried to leave. It was the uniform stance of the international community, even though they had voted unanimously at the UN to quarantine the entire country indefinitely. And it was what Anastasia and Paolo's parents told them whenever they prepared to leave the house to make a trip to the hypermarket for supplies. For the survivors of the epidemic, trapped in the capital city, it was considered patriotic to continue with daily life, to persevere as if nothing was out of the ordinary. The Ministry of Education kept schools within the perimeter in session, and the hypermarkets had been ordered to remain open, although they had to comply with the government rationing requirements. This prevented bank runs and price gouging, and kept the shelves from being stripped bare by panic purchasing. And yet, people mumbled under their breath in close quarters, behind closed doors. They admitted their anxiety about the food running out, for fewer and fewer supply trucks were able to get through the horde and safely to the barriers. They wondered if the perimeter would hold. They made plans for what to do if, when the zombies broke through, where they would go, how they would flee, with whom. Don't panic. All is under control. That was still the official word on the radio when some of the schools began to close, despite the decrees from the Ministry of Education. Anastasia remembered the day hers did. They were in geometry class when a scream startled everyone. Students and teacher turned to the window, where they saw Mrs. Awaru, the health and biology teacher, running, holding up her skirt, her face contorted in sheer terror as a running zombie chased after her. She was saved only by the quickness of the groundskeeper and the headmaster, who, at great risk to their own lives, tackled the zombie and tied it up. Even bound and restrained with thick ropes, the zombie thrashed and writhed, snapping its teeth to catch a bite of living flesh. When one of the children recognized the zombie as Mr. Singe, the kindly Indian man who sold them chapatis, chai, and curry chicken from the kiosk across the road, the headmaster decided to close the school until further notice. A second, shuffling zombie was spotted rummaging through the rubbish bin later that day. No one recognized the victim from around the neighborhood, so it was thought that this second zombie was one that had slipped in through the perimeter, although some people still refused to believe it could even happen, and some parents still thought the school had a patriotic duty to remain open. But the headmaster was adamant and sent a regretful letter home to parents, informing them that he and the staff could no longer guarantee the safety of the children. Don't panic. All is under control. It was what Anastasia and Paolo's parents repeated that very Saturday morning, or was it Friday? Anastasia had lost track. Without school and without being able to leave the house, for the curfew did not allow children outside in public even during the day without proper supervision, one day just looked like every other. Anastasia wasn't panicked herself or worried as much as she was bored. It was house arrest as far as she was concerned. The television was a monotonous bore, more news stories on zombies or reruns of game shows and reality TV. The other channels were only showing happy films to cheer people up, Bollywood films, Disney movies from the 80s and 90s, Pixar flicks, but no Nollywood films. Those were too full of drama, conflict, and some stories even featured plot lines with juju, which government censors thought might just add to people's worries. So Nollywood was out. So was Big Brother Africa, Survivor, or any other reality shows that featured people stuck in houses or on islands trying to get along, or not. That was too close to reality. "Watch your brother while we are out," Anastasia's mother said, kissing her and Paolo on their heads before she left with their father for the grocery run. "'Kay, Mom," Anastasia said from the couch. She didn't look up to meet her mother's warm, almond-shaped eyes as she was deeply engrossed in her phone. She had downloaded the latest game that was all the rage in the country that week, Zombie Killers Africa Edition, and was playing with her friends, who were also all on lockdown, all hopelessly bored, and tired of it all. They griped through Anastasia's earbuds, while their avatars chopped off zombie limbs with machetes or bashed their heads with cricket bats or hammers, the points of each kill rising up from the bloody remains like the souls zombies didn't have. Anastasia's avatar stalked into a room along with her friends, Alba, Winnie, and James. Alba's character, a tall, fierce warrior queen with long braids and bare arms clasped in gold bangles, drew back a bow and fired an arrow into a zombie creeping up on Winnie's sorceress, clad resplendently in her white robe. "Thanks," Winnie's voice sounded from the left earbud. "Anytime," Alba said in the right. "Don't let your guard down. I think the level boss is in the next room," James said. Anastasia could hear him chomping gum in his ear. "Ew, gross. That is so annoying, James. Spit your gum out," Alba said. "Sorry, I get nervous," James said. "It helps me concentrate. Whoa, here he comes." The level boss came charging through a wall and into their midst, a mutated, two-headed zombie elephant complete with 4 tusks and 2 trunks. It would be a handful. As they were coordinating their attack and dodging an ambush of zombie minions from just outside the frame of the screen, Paolo tugged on Anastasia's trouser leg. Her brother was sitting at the other end of the couch watching television. He had flipped through the channels to land on a news station. Another reporter was interviewing another police captain, or was it an army captain? They all looked the same now, sharing uniforms and body armor, and they all looked fatigued with red, sleepless eyes and ever leaner faces due to the diminishing rations. This officer offered the same old drivel about working day and night to maintain vigilance while the MOH developed a cure, blah, blah, blah. "Sia, do you think they will find a cure soon?" Paolo asked. "Sure," Anastasia said, whacking off the head of a zombie minion and dodging a fireball from the trunk of the elephant. "When?" Paolo asked, peering up over her phone now. "At your 6, Winnie." Anastasia wheeled around to slice another zombie in half at the waist. "Not now, Paolo." "What's that?" James asked. "Nothing, just my annoying brother." "Stay focused," James said. "I am focused. Alba, we need your arrows over here." "Got it." "Winnie, go for the boss. It's going to take magic. I got you covered from the zombie squirrels," James said. "Ugh, they are so gross. Look at the splatter," Winnie said as one of the squirrels got flattened by James's mallet. "You can tell this was developed by American or European gamers. There are no squirrels in Africa. There should be monkeys or something instead," Anastasia said. "Good point," Alba said, firing a fusillade of arrows. "Focus, team," James said. The elephant moved upon them, closing off their room to maneuver. "I can't get the angle with the arrows," Alba said. "I got you." Winnie's sorceress sent over a flux of magic that cleared the space around Alba. "No, Winnie, focus on the boss," James said. "God, James, you are so bossy." "No, he's right. Even if he chews gum like a cow on quad," Anastasia said, "you've got the best weapon to take him out." "They're saying that the police are pulling back the perimeter in Greenfield Estates and Yaya Market." Paolo interrupted Anastasia again, his eyes wide with alarm. "Paolo, not now," Anastasia said. "But, Sia, we need you." I'm here, Anastasia said, jamming in her earbud and jumping off the couch. This was too critical a moment to be distracted by her dumb brother. "Sia, why are you breathing in my ear like that?" Winnie asked. "I'm running upstairs to get away from my brother. He is such a troll," Anastasia said, slamming the door to her room and throwing herself across her bed. "I've got bottom of the screen," Alba said. "South," James said, a stickler for cardinal directions when playing. "Your bottom is not my bottom." "I'll say." "Whatever." "Winnie, get in position. Do your thing." "Roger." Winnie leapt into the air to land facing down the 2 elephant heads. Before they could rip her apart with their serrated tusks, Winnie blasted out an aura of spells, one pulse after another. The elephant shook, hit points rising up over it, tallying to their team score. The dead flesh of the elephant dropped off, exposing bones, musculature, and empty hollows. "All right," James said. "Hold on, check this out," Winnie said. Anastasia could hear the smile in her voice. Her sorceress spun in a circle like a dancer, her robes expanding like a flower in bloom. A tight spiral of light enveloped her for an instant before expanding out into a hurricane, its power passing safely over her teammates, but obliterating the squirrels, the minions, and finally shattering the elephant into clumps of smoking flesh and stringy entrails. Whoa, that was some finishing move. Gross. Awesome. The hit points continued to tally up. Anastasia could hear the others shifting out of their seats, running to the fridge for food or drinks while the next level loaded. Anastasia rolled on her back and stared up at the ceiling, where her glow-in-the-dark stars were stuck on the plaster, yellow-green and boring in the light of day. "We rock," James said. "We ought to. This is all we do anymore," Winnie said, over the sound of her unwrapping a snack of some kind. "I heard they were going to be shifting all the school lessons to online teaching," Alba said. "Ugh, so boring. I'm tired of being inside," Alba said. "Me too," Anastasia added. James was silent, unnaturally so, which meant he was probably on mute, which also meant he was likely taking a pee. Anastasia would hold off asking him for his opinion. "I miss going out to school," she said. "At this rate, we won't ever graduate to go to university." "I heard the perimeter's falling back again," Winnie said around her food. "Yeah, Paolo said something to me about Greenfield and Yaya Market. Not just there, but Gathare and Marabella Estates too," Alba said. "Really?" "Yeah, they just didn't want to announce that too because they don't want people to panic." "Don't panic. All is under control," Anastasia mocked in an officious tone. Background noise from the radio and the voices of James's brothers and sisters cut back in as James unmuted himself. "Those are just rumors," he said. "James, I hope you washed your hands," Winnie giggled. "Those rumors have a way of being true," Alba said. "My neighbor's house just got cordoned off and quarantined night before last. We haven't heard from them since," Winnie said. "No way." They were all silent a while, the download circle pinwheeling on the screen amid their avatar profile pictures, looking by turns fierce, serene, and noble, belying the anxiety Anastasia knew they all were suddenly feeling. The real world was intruding on their virtual one. James was eager to retreat back into fantasy, immediately yammering on about what to expect on the next level. Anastasia thought of Paolo, those normally eager eyes of his instead filled with alarm. "The next level has ghosts in it," James said, chewing gum again. "James, really?" Alba's voice was exasperated. "Yeah, ghosts. I mean, the developers need to pick a lane, right? Is this a fantasy game or sci-fi? You can't have both. It doesn't make sense." "No, James, I meant the gum." "That's what you two are talking about? When we could be the next zombies in real life?" Winnie scolded. "It's not worth worrying about. The government says it's under control," James said. "I don't know. No one has seen President Wakumbu in weeks. You think she's infected?" Anastasia asked. "I think we will need more magic on the next level because I don't know if Alba's arrows are going to affect the ghosts." "James," Anastasia rolled her eyes. "Come on. We all know the president left on a private jet and is hiding out at some fancy resort in the Seychelles until this blows over," James said. "It does make you wonder, though, regarding your first remark, James," Winnie said. "The one about rumors?" "No, the one about fantasy and sci-fi. I mean, if there are such things as zombies in real life these days, why not ghosts?" "Well, I know there are both in this game, and the level is 90% finished loading." Real life. Anastasia slid her eyes from the screen and took in her room. The colors were muted compared to the graphics of the game, even on her most outrageous posters and magazine cutouts. Clothes, some dirty, some clean and in need of folding, were scattered about. Her school uniform hung on a hanger, pressed and ready, but sadly unused for weeks. Her laptop with all its stickers was closed, and her school textbooks and notebooks were growing fuzzy with dust. What was real life? A mess. And here they were, disappearing into a game of pixels and techno music, while advertisements flashed at them at the bottom of the screen. Anastasia rolled over, one of her earbuds falling out. She was suddenly, uncomfortably aware of the quiet in her house. It extended even to the street outside. There were no cars, no voices of people in the lanes between, no hawking of sellers, not even the thwack-thwack of a helicopter or the distant roar of a jet plane. She couldn't see or hear the zombie hordes, but she could feel them in the oppressive silence, the sense of being trapped in an ever-shrinking space. She wished her parents were home already. "Hey, all, I need to sign off." "You all right, Anastasia?" Winnie asked. "Yeah, I just think I should check on my brother." "We're at 95%. "I'll be back soon, James. The beginning of the level is always the easiest." Your funeral. Whatever, BRB. Bye, see ya. Later. See ya. Anastasia signed off, closed the app, and called out for Paulo, yelling his name loud enough that he would hear her through her door. When he didn't respond, she immediately felt annoyed. A second before, it had felt like he was dying for her to talk to him. Now he wasn't even paying attention. Figures. She yanked out the other earbud, threw her phone down onto the bed, and slipped her feet back into her house sandals. When she opened the door and started downstairs, her sandals slapped loudly in the stairwell. She called out again, imagining her brother zoned out in front of the television. "Paolo, what are you doing?" Still no answer. She turned down the hall, her footsteps echoing in the empty kitchen and the quiet dining room. When she turned into the living room, she saw the couch was empty. The television was still on, but the volume was low, so she wasn't sure why Paolo had not heard her. The lights were on, and the television had been switched to a channel playing The Lion King. She rolled her eyes, picked up the remote, and clicked it off. "Paolo!" Still nothing. The couch cushions still held the shape of her brother where he had been seated. She felt as if he were still present, maybe just lurking behind the couch, ready to scare her. She preempted him by leaping onto the cushions and leaning over the wicker back of the couch with a loud, "Yeah!" But Paolo was not there either. She saw nothing but empty space and the flat of the floor between the couch back and the wall. It was where Paolo always liked to hide, but perhaps he was trying to change things up. She checked behind her father's favorite chair in the corner, but he was not hiding there either. "Come on, Paolo. I don't feel like playing hide-and-seek right now. Mom and Dad will be angry if I tell them you were hiding from me." Anastasia knew they were much more likely to be angry at her for not watching her brother more closely, but she was not about to admit that and lose leverage over him. She checked the dining room, the kitchen pantry, the laundry room, and all the downstairs closets. She even went back upstairs to look in his room, then in the upstairs closet, then her father and mother's study, which they were not allowed to enter. She peeked in the door. "Paolo, if you are in here, you are in big trouble." But he wasn't. "If he's gone outside without me, I'll make sure Mom and Dad give him such a beating." Their yard had a wall and grounds that were the envy of the neighborhood. This was thanks to their gardener, Peter Motinda. He was an older blind man, but he somehow kept the bushes trimmed neatly and the flowers flourishing year-round. The vegetables and tubers he grew were fecund miracles. He had even managed to bring on young blind children and youth to mentor as apprentices, teaching them how to live and perceive the world through their other senses. Anastasia loved the garden, and it was safe, mostly, but Paolo was definitely not allowed outside to play in it without her. Now her fury at his disobedience was brewing over, and she slapped the door outside open, noting that it had been left unlocked. He definitely came through here, and didn't even lock the door. I'll kill him. Their garden walls were high, as were the walls around their front courtyard. Their neighbors on either side of them were vigilant, but with stories of running zombies scaling walls around the city, she knew they could not be too careful. "Paolo!" She ran down the passageway between the house and the wall separating them from the neighbor's lot, grateful when she stepped into the wider space of the back garden. The garden was terraced, 3 levels sloping down with a variety of stonework, wicker lawn furniture, and an open green lawn for football or badminton. Lattice canopies, shady with vines of bougainvillea, stretched over the walkways and sitting areas. There was even a Japanese rock garden. It took the place of a fountain or pool. Those were out of the question since they were breeding havens for mosquitoes and thus malaria. Although Anastasia still felt short with her brother, she could not help but feel a little sense of peace creep into her, shifting her ire to a lighter shade of irritation. It was the magic of Peter's green spaces. She decided she would not beat Paolo herself, and didn't want her parents to beat him either, but she would sure give him a stern scolding. But first she had to find him. "Paolo!" No answer. But as she descended down to the second terrace, something else caught her eye. Footprints straight across the carefully raked sands of the Japanese rock garden. The lines in the sand were smooth and perfect, without blemish, wobble, or sharp edges. They radiated like ripples in a pond from stones that sat with the immobile presence of deep thoughts. The arrangements and features were always the more striking, considering their gardener's blindness. But now, some idiot, maybe her brother, had walked across them. Without giving it too much more thought as to whom, Anastasia ran down the third set of stone steps into the lowest bit of the garden. This section had a shady trellis, as well as an open swath of lawn they used for games. It was here that Anastasia spotted the interloper. He was a kid. By his size, likely between her age of 13 and Paolo's 9. The intruder's back was turned, but Anastasia knew much about him already by his khaki-colored safari jacket, matching cargo pants, and even a pith helmet like a 19th-century safari hunter. A tourist, and likely an American at that. He was clearly lost, having wandered away from whatever hotel he was trapped in because of the canceled international flights, although Anastasia had imagined that the quarantine of her country would have just been for her people. Foreigners, with their money, connections, and simple sense of entitlement, often seem to find ways around the rules imposed on them by a third-world, developing country. Anastasia rolled her eyes hard for the second time that morning. The tourist boy's credentials were made all the more obvious by the beaded Maasai-themed camera strap around his neck. He had probably been charged an outrageous tourist price for it, too. But Anastasia never had any sympathy for whites who were charged more for items she and the other locals would pay a tenth of the price for. She thought of it as a white privilege tax. They could afford it, so be it. The boy was hunched over, eating something. She couldn't see what, but she could hear the munching and slobbering. She imagined his face even before she saw it, as rotund, sunburned, smeared with chocolate. Sadly, this was the stereotype she and her friends held for most Americans. She circled, taking in his getup, the pockets down the pant legs, the pouches on the vest, the leopard print on the seams and cuffs. Do they even know what parodies they make of themselves? "Excuse me, but you are on private property," she began to say. The boy grunted and whipped around with preternatural speed. Something flew off his face, a bit of melted chocolate, perhaps. It didn't take long for Anastasia to realize she had made a grave mistake. The boy's face was not smeared with chocolate, but with blood. His skin was an alabaster shade of white with patches of gray. His eyes, opened wide like a frightened animal, were bluish white. But the most horrifying aspect was not even his appearance, but rather who he was eating. Paolo. Her brother lay semi-conscious, his clothes disheveled and dirty, his hair full of dried grass and leaves, as if he had struggled with the zombie of the white American boy before being dragged down to this place where, no longer able to wait, the zombie boy had taken a bite of Paolo's shoulder. The boy stalked closer to Anastasia. How she wished she had not left her phone on her bed. The boy rolled his tongue around his mouth, lapping up her brother's blood. She had to do something, but she wasn't sure what. She could run, leading the zombie away, but she still needed to get her brother help. The boy took another step towards her, the broken telephoto lens of his camera looking at her like a lopsided eye. As a newly infected victim, his body was not dead or rotting. He would be able to pursue her with adrenaline-fueled speed and strength, and zombie hunger. Anastasia wanted to call for help, but her heart was stuck in her throat, her pulse pounding in her neck. If she cried out, would it provoke him or scare him? Was there a rock or stick she could use? Could she even make it to the steps, much less the house? Paolo let out a soft groan. It distracted the zombie for a second, his face turning back towards his catch, his tongue flicking out. Many things happened at once. Anastasia started forward, determined to knock the zombie down, grab her brother, and make a run for it. But just as she stepped forward, an equal force yanked backwards on her collar, pulling her in the opposite direction. A voice she knew well, Esmeralda, Peter the gardener's latest apprentice, spoke a soft but firm order in her ear. "Wait." Esmeralda's voice was calm and steady. Did she not know there was a zombie there? She was also blind, but somehow she had snuck up behind Anastasia without even the zombie noticing. "Just wait, Anastasia," she repeated. At the same moment, Peter Motinda appeared in the side of Anastasia's vision, his body erect, his head tilted slightly back, his eyes closed as if he were in a state of serene prayer. Only the twitch of his jaw betrayed his fierce concentration as he took in the scene with his other senses. The zombie was startled, his head wagging back and forth, his hands out to his sides like a skateboarder trying to regain his balance. It was just the hesitation Peter needed. He pulled his cane from his belt. It was the folding type that quickly snapped out to full length. He swung it, ninja-like, at the zombie. He struck the boy's head, stunning him for a moment before the zombie belatedly put up his hands. Peter struck again, now at the boy's exposed sides, the cane swooshing through the air and cracking in loud slaps against the torso, the arms, and the back of the zombie. The boy spun in circles, not able to anticipate where the next lightning strike would come from. As if by a design Peter had already planned, the zombie began to retreat from Paolo, the gardener corralling him into the open, the small bloody hands raised and fingers curled like the claws of a cornered cat. "Now, Esmeralda," Peter said. The pressure around Anastasia's neck released, and Esmeralda leapt past Anastasia, dancing around Paolo's inert body and playing out a length of rope, the end of which she threw out to Peter. He caught it, reaching his hand out to the side without needing to turn his head, as if he had known the rope would be in that precise point in space, at that precise point in time all along. Then the two of them ran in opposite directions, circling the zombie, Peter walking in slow, measured steps clockwise, while Esmeralda moved counterclockwise, impossibly somersaulting over Peter's length of rope on each rotation, just before she would have otherwise tripped over it. Before the zombie could escape, they had him wrapped up, once, twice, 3 times, and more, his whole body bound up like a little grub. With a yank, they tipped him over so that he fell face down, growling and snarling, bound like an angry warthog, but unable to harm anyone further with his snapping jaws. Peter and Esmeralda had that bloody mouth of his gagged in short order. The zombie subdued and Esmeralda standing guard over him, Peter moved to Paolo's side. Anastasia was already over her brother. He was sweating, his eyes fluttering while he murmured softly as if crying out for help, lost in a great, distant nightmare. "Is he bit?" Peter asked. "Yes, on his shoulder. It looks bad, Peter. Will he be okay?" Peter did not say so, only, "Let's get him into the house." The house fell into chaos. It was nothing short of a catastrophe, and Anastasia knew it was all her fault. Her parents returned home shortly after they had carried Paolo into the house. Their panic was immediate and overwhelming, both of them distraught, manic in their worry for their son. The disaster was all-consuming, but it was only the beginning. Anastasia's parents' fury at her was beyond description, literally, for neither could even find the words to confront her. Instead, they glared at her in deep disappointment, a silent harbinger of the consequences she knew were coming. She felt a rift open between her parents and herself, deep and wide as a chasm. Anastasia wanted to curl up in a ball of shame under her bed, disappear down a deep hole. Yet she had to know what was going on, what was happening to Paolo. Would he be all right? He had to be all right, she told herself. She sat on the floor against the wall in the corridor outside Paolo's room, her knees to her chest, invisible as her family tended to Paolo. Her grandmother Elizabeth and aunties Beatrice and Khadija had come over, a nurse, a doctor, and an herbalist respectively. They monitored Paolo's worsening condition, crushed herbs into powders and made salves and potions for his wound. They hung an IV next to the bed and stuck a needle into his arm. Anastasia listened as they told her mother that they could delay the change, but no one yet knew how to stop it altogether, much less reverse it. There was no cure. Her mother wept. Her father wept. Anastasia wept. Esmeralda stood guard outside the door. After seeing what the gardener's apprentice had done outside, Anastasia felt miserable, but at least safe sitting next to her. Peter's training was indeed wondrous, and Anastasia looked on Esmeralda in a new light. Esmeralda, for her part, had always been tall for her age, taller than Anastasia, with golden skin, dark braids, and, although they were unseeing, gemstone green eyes. Anastasia had once remarked to her mother how beautiful Esmeralda was, and admitted her sorrow that Esmeralda could not see it. "There is more important beauty than that which is skin-deep and superficial," her mother had said, "and Esmeralda, being blind, knows that. It is a valuable lesson to know so young." Anastasia's mother was often full of such insights, but right now she was only weeping and inconsolable. She would not leave Paolo's side. Anastasia knew better than to try to comfort her or even seek forgiveness. Anastasia was the root of the tragedy. She would only make things worse by showing her face to her mother. It didn't matter how remorseful she was. Anastasia's father did emerge from the room, stopping outside the door to look down at her, but his words still would not come. His hurt, anger, and worry were all too great. She wished he would yell and at least begin the process of punishment. It would hurt, but it would at least be movement towards a place where everything would eventually be okay. But maybe that place didn't exist anymore. "Daddy, I'm sorry." But he was already receding down the hall, covering his face with his hands. "Sia, I'm sorry," Esmeralda said, her eyes unfocused but her expression sympathetic. "I know you didn't mean. I wish I were dead. I wish he had bit me." "Sia, don't say—" But Anastasia didn't hear the rest of Esmeralda's words. Instead, she ran into her room and slammed the door shut behind her. Hours passed. Anastasia cried herself to sleep, woke up from nightmares, cried more, fell asleep, the cycle repeating throughout the night. She knew by the light in the windows and the chirping of birds that morning had come, but the regular sounds of the house were conspicuously missing. Aside from the shuffling of feet in and out of her brother's room and a few muted whispers, a dreadful silence had descended on their entire compound. The normal noises of cooking, washing, and the gate opening and closing were all absent. She never realized how accustomed she had become to the clamor of Paolo running his mouth to their mother or to Peter the gardener. Paolo always talked too much. At least that was what Anastasia had told him. Now she regretted all the times she had not listened to him, all the times she had ignored him and failed to treasure his voice. Anastasia cried some more. There was no point in getting out of bed. It must have been mid-morning when there was a knock at her door, followed by a voice. "Anastasia, it is Peter. May I come in?" She had already not followed the rules set down by adults, and that had cost her brother his life. Anastasia was not about to ignore a request from Peter, especially since he had saved her life. She got up and opened the door. Old Peter stood there in his gardening coveralls. They fit his lean frame well and were always pressed, even if a bit faded in parts and the edges of the pockets frayed. His beard was gray and plaited into thick locks. His wide-brimmed red hat held down the hair on his head, even though it looked ready to pop out in a soft, springy explosion. He kept his head held up, as if to best capture signs and signals with the senses he did use, sounds, smells, even shifts in the air on his face. There was always a line of focus on his forehead that gave him a proud and attentive look. Anastasia had known him all her life to be a good listener, and sometimes, Anastasia felt, Peter saw her better than anyone. Peter's eyes had golden brown irises. Like Esmeralda's, they were unseeing, yet she knew well how effectively he perceived the space around him. For that reason, she knew there was no reason to escort him into her room. He could find his way. Instead, she returned to her bed and curled up in a ball between her pillows. Peter took a few soft steps forward before sitting down on the edge of her bed, his hands resting on his cane, his back straight. "How is Paolo?" she asked. "Still unconscious. Your grandmother and aunts have him comfortable." "But the change?" Peter frowned, his eyebrows gathered in. "To our knowledge, it is irreversible." She squeezed her eyes shut as tears began to flow again. "Peter, I'm so sorry. Thank you for saving me, but I wish it had been me." "Shh, don't say that." But it's true, Motinda, she said, using the name she had called him growing up. This is the worst thing that could have happened. The worst thing I could have done. Peter inclined his head downward and replied in a soft, gravelly voice, You're right, Anastasia. It might be. She would have cried again if she had not felt such a wave of humiliation at his words and a flare of anger that followed, one she directed at Peter, but she knew it was really at herself. Did you come here to shame me? No, I did not, my little starflower, he said, reaching out for her, laying his hand flat on the bed between them. I know your shame is already great. Your pain is punishment enough. I'm not here to add to it. That would serve little purpose. She sniffed. Then why did you come? To urge you to have hope. Hope? How can I have hope when this is the worst thing? Because this is the worst thing, and it is sometimes the worst thing that gives us opportunity. Peter was speaking into the empty space in front of him, but she noticed how he inclined his head towards her, his ear picking up the way she shifted. She said nothing. She didn't understand, but he knew that he had captured her attention. Let me tell you a story, Sia, like when you were little. Would that be all right? Yeah. Well, it is about a young boy who wanted to be a painter. A little brother like Paolo, by turns sweet, inquisitive, and maybe a little annoying, as little brothers can be. This he said with a knowing tilt of his head. This boy had a big sister, too, named Tamarit. He adored her, and she had so many friends. He was always asking to tag along, which was a great source of irritation for her. I can understand that. Peter opened his hands, relaxing his grip on his cane for a moment. One time, this boy was sick with malaria, and while their parents were busy working, they were not a rich family and struggled to keep food on the table and to meet the costs of school books and uniforms. Tamarit was tasked with caring for her brother. Well, she resented being stuck at home when she wanted to go out with her many friends, but it was her job to give her brother his medicine every 2 hours. So in order to buy herself enough time to sneak out and meet up with her friends, she gave her brother double his normal dose of medicine so she could go out for 4 hours while he slept. He would be fine, and she would see her friends and be back before their parents returned. It was the perfect compromise. And her plan worked, or at least she thought it had. Tamarit went out and returned to find her brother sleeping. It was only when he woke that she realized her catastrophic mistake. She had ignored the warning label on the bottle. Too much medicine at any one time could lead to irreversible side effects. In this case, it was blindness. She blinded her brother? Yes. Wait, Motinda, was that boy you? He was. Anastasia felt a hollow feeling inside her stomach, and her head felt light. I never realized, he nodded. It is not a story I tell often, for people see much tragedy in it. A boy who wanted to be a painter rendered blind, his dreams ruined, his sister so ashamed she ran away from home. We never knew what happened to Tamarit after that. Motinda, I'm so sorry. Peter shrugged. Many people have said the same when they hear this story. It is full of sorrows, and yet, can I tell you a secret? Of course. The secret is, I've come to love the life I've been gifted. He paused a moment to let the words sink in. Being blind has made me aware of other things I would have never known. The love and care of others who mentored me, the richness of the worlds of sound, smell, taste, and touch, the forgotten senses of temperature, movement, orientation in space, and I have still been able to expand my ability to create, maybe not with paint, but with life. Flowers, vines, trees, and bushes, even the sands of the rock gardens have become my canvases. But those are not even the best gifts. The best gifts have been the children I have had the opportunity to mentor and teach to also live in a world without sight. Like Esmeralda, and many others. What she did with you in the garden, to the zombie boy, it was amazing. Peter shrugged again, as if it was nothing, just as mundane as raking leaves, trimming a bush, or coaxing a vine to grow onto a trellis. For a moment, Anastasia did feel some tranquility, as she pictured the serene spaces Peter had created over the years, and the steady rotation of other blind children he would take under his wing for a few months at a time, before they grew independent and were able to set out into the world on their own. But the feelings were quickly overshadowed. These stories were not the same as her own. There would be no happy ending for Paolo. Anastasia began to cry again as she said as much. "We don't know how this story will end," Peter said. "You think you will be okay?" Peter's pause spoke volumes before he said with a sigh, "I don't know. I think not." "Then how can there be hope?" Anastasia asked, her voice cracking. Why had he told her the stupid story in the first place? "Sometimes, while in the worst of times, we have to create our own hope and fight to claim our own promise. I will not mislead you, Anastasia. It may take time and the way can be full of pain, but suffering ceases to be suffering when we can give a meaning to it. This is a hard lesson to learn, and we need friends to remind us of it. But it is our only chance if we wish to persevere." "I don't see—" Anastasia bit her tongue at her awkward word choice, but it didn't appear to insult Peter in the slightest. "You will, Starflower. You will." Anastasia woke from another shallow sleep, disturbed by nightmares and the tears sliding sideways across her face. Her pillow was dark and damp where they had been landing. She was still alone in her room, but her phone was vibrating. She didn't move to see who it was, instead letting it ring to voicemail. The light had changed. It must have been afternoon. The lanes and streets of the neighborhood in a city under curfew were still eerie in their silence, although even in her sleep, Anastasia had heard the gate rattle open, the coming and going of their vehicle, and the opening and shutting of doors, likely as her grandmother and aunts went back and forth, seeking medicines, pharmaceutical and traditional, to help her brother, delaying the inevitable. If the Ministry of Health heard of her brother's condition or the zombie boy, where had they put him, she wondered? They would all be quarantined. The phone buzzed again. She let it go to voicemail again. Then it buzzed for a third series of rings. Anastasia finally leaned over from her pillows and looked at the screen to see who wanted to speak with her so badly as to call 3 times. A picture of her cousin in the Caliande region appeared on the screen, her face dark under a bright yellow head wrap, her face characterized by sharp eyes and striking cheekbones. Underneath the profile picture was her name, Jambi. Anastasia didn't want to talk to anyone really, but she would talk to her cousin. She clicked on the phone and her cousin's face appeared in real time on the screen against the backdrop of her bedroom. Jambi's hair was braided in medium-sized cornrows, with a few shiny wood beads and cowrie shells worked into the ends. She was wearing a purple t-shirt that read in 3 lines, "Shirts with haiku, they're sort of overrated. I will not wear one." "Hey, Jambi." "Sia, I heard the news. I'm sorry." "Thanks. How's Paolo?" I don't know. They are slowing the change, but it's irreversible. I haven't left my room." "Why?" "Because it's all my fault." Anastasia took a few moments to master her crying, then proceeded to relate the story of just how her brother had come to be bitten. Jambi listened. She was attentive, her eyes sympathetic while she made soft noises of assent, sympathy, or both. Like Peter, Anastasia had always known her cousin to be a good listener. "So you see, Jambi, it's all my fault. I just wish I were dead." Jambi's next words, even her tone, surprised her. "Anastasia, I need you to listen to me. This is very important." Anastasia wiped her nose. Okay. You need to do something. It's going to mean pulling yourself together, leaving your room, even leaving the house. My parents won't ever let me. They won't even notice." Anastasia sucked in her breath. Jambi was probably right. "But why?" "I don't know if it will help Paolo, but it might be the key to turning this zombie thing around." Anastasia had been so wrapped up in herself, She had not even asked Jambi how she was, how her family was, whether or not they too were trapped. They lived out in Kalyande, in the countryside, where the outbreak had begun after all. Jambi, I'm sorry I didn't even ask. How are you? Your family? Have you all been under attack? Are you surrounded under curfew too? We were. The zombies started out here, but they all headed away to the capital. Anastasia swallowed, imagining that if that were the case, millions of zombies would have been closing in on them, a sea of the undead, shamblers and runners surrounding the city in such numbers that supplies would eventually not get through. But why? I don't know, but I have some friends who told me— Which friends? Anastasia asked. Her cousin had some notoriety in her family and in her village for having survived an ordeal of many days hiking into the wilderness and up the unforgiving slopes of Mount Kalyande to retrieve water from a spring that allegedly had healed her father, Anastasia's uncle, Marito. Some had even said that Jambi had returned in the talons of a giant mountain bird. Jambi did not talk about the experience much, and Anastasia knew how village people could exaggerate stories, but still everyone regarded Jambi as wise, even her older sisters, who were all successful in their own right as businesswomen and entertainers. Anastasia had learned never to question Jambi. People in their family speculated that Jambi could even talk to spirits, but this was something else Anastasia's cousin was circumspect about. Well, they are some friends I met once, but I still see them in my dreams, Jambi said, her eyes darting off to the corner of her room. Jambi, you really are a seer then? Shh, I don't know what to call myself. I just know from them that there is a woman. She's sort of a renowned philosopher-scientist from the southern region. She's a genius, and she's farther along in figuring out this plague than anyone else. But she's going to need your help. Mine? What could I do? How does she know me? She doesn't, yet. You will have to explain to her, but I think she will get it. The institute she founded is located in your part of the city. Okay. So what's the address? What's her name? Anastasia asked. Do you have a pen and paper? Anastasia went to her desk, pushed aside her school books, and uncapped a pen. Ready? Jambi took a breath. Her name is Dr. Latia Soleil, MDiv, MD, PhD. Anastasia wrote the name down and all the credentials too. If Jambi was mentioning them, they must be important. Wow, with all those letters after her name, she's got to know something. I hope so. Jambi had been right. With everything going on at Anastasia's home with Paolo and his worsening condition, it was more than easy for her to move about the house unnoticed, gathering a few things in preparation for sneaking out. Jambi had given Anastasia the address for Dr. Soleil's office at the Saitoti Research Institute. No taxis or buses were running, but Anastasia estimated she could walk there in 35 minutes or so. It was what might be waiting for her outside the safety of her family's compound that had her worried. She knew she would need her phone, as well as a backpack with snacks, water, rope, and even a first aid kit, although she hoped she wouldn't need it. Otherwise, Anastasia kept the packing light, in case she had to run for her life. She knew the reality of the dire situation zombies presented. She knew she would need to carry something to defend herself with. She stole a machete from the garden shed that was used for trimming grass and hedges. It was what her avatar would have done in the Killing Zombies Africa Edition video game. But in real life, where zombies were real people like her brother, she was not sure if she would ever be able to actually swing it to hurt one. But she took it anyway. It was not difficult to slip out the door in the gate. Anastasia eased it open slowly so that the hinges did not squeak. The trickiest bit was closing it behind her and making sure the lock did not make too much noise clicking into place. With the zombie boy intruder and the threat of officials coming to quarantine their house, everyone would be listening for the slightest noise at the gate, especially with Peter and Esmeralda as vigilant as they were. In the end, Anastasia knew some noise could not be helped, and leaving the gate unlocked was unacceptable, as it would have put her family and friends at further risk. So she pulled it shut and simply ran, making sure that if anyone did come to look, she would be long gone by the time they reached the gate to peek out. She finally stopped running after rounding 2 corners and ducking under a footpath between roads, where local sellers had set up booths and stalls. They were all closed, as if it were a national holiday. Usually the footpath here was busy with pedestrian traffic, shoppers, hawkers, hagglers, and people sitting under umbrellas pitched over plastic tables and chairs while they drank soft drinks or tea. But today there was not a single person. The footpath was empty, but for a few candy wrappers rustling past in an anemic breeze, and a half-dozen used scratch cards for mobile phone airtime sunk into the mud. Above, the cloudy afternoon sky was a sickly shade of yellow, as if a sandstorm had swept over the city. It reminded Anastasia of pictures she had seen of the months the harmattan would blow down from the Sahara in West Africa. She wasn't sure why, but Anastasia kept running down the length of the lane. Maybe it was because she was still close to home and people here might recognize her. She pictured some of the booth owners hiding inside, looking out as she passed. When the lane ended at the T-junction of roads, which were also empty, she took the road leading west to the main highway. The main road had wide margins on either side, with dirt footpaths packed down from the passage of thousands of feet every day. Tall jacaranda and Melinda flame trees grew in rows on both sides of the highway, providing shade on sunnier days. In normal times, people would be walking to the bus stops. Sellers would be roasting chicken, pork, and maize or frying potatoes. Women would have been selling bananas, mangoes, or oranges to commuters who would toss the rinds to the ground. Men would be hawking mobile phone chargers and cases to people at bus stops. But again, today things were desolate. Anastasia moved within the shelter of the trees, ducking from the cover of one trunk to the next. Here on the main road, she did see a car, an SUV with tinted windows, driving well over the speed limit as the driver and passengers rushed from one destination to the next, limiting their time outside in the wide open. Anyone would be crazy not to rush, I guess. Even crazier to be out on foot, she thought. The main road led right to the city center. Anastasia found herself hiding behind bushes and trash cans when other cars passed. 2 Ministry of Health trucks went by in a convoy with police cars, as well as 2 more private cars. They all turned down the road, leading to one of the only hypermarkets that remained open. It had high walls around the parking lot, so it had been able to keep its customers safe. It was the open-air markets that had been closed since early in the plague, since they had no walls themselves. But with the plague continuing, the zombie numbers growing, Anastasia wondered again how many more supply trucks would be able to enter the city to resupply even the hypermarkets. When she reached the heart of downtown, Anastasia continued to jog, the backpack bouncing on her back, the machete growing heavy in her arm. No messages, no missed calls on her phone. No one had noticed she was missing. She spied a few people on foot. A tight bunch of men with sticks and machetes, a community watch patrolling for zombies. She hid behind some bushes until they had passed, as they would likely have sent her home if they had caught her. To her astonishment, she saw one man in running shorts, a headband, and earbuds jogging down the street. He had nothing in his hands to defend himself. He did have a nylon belt wrapped around his waist with little bottles of colored athletic drinks. He was white, of course, which made perfect sense to Anastasia. Foreigners often fell into 2 categories: those who walked about terrified of Africa, with bottles of bug spray, sunblock, and mace, and those who felt invulnerable and acted like they had no sense whatsoever. This man was clearly the latter. As he neared, she could hear the music blaring in his headphones. For him, she felt obliged to give up her hiding place and step out onto the sidewalk to warn him of the danger he was in, but he swerved around her, shouting as if to hear himself over his music. "Sorry, me don't have any change to give you, little girl." He patted away on his expensive running shoes. Anastasia rolled her eyes. Me don't have. At least he was headed in the direction of the community patrol. Perhaps they would see him and talk some sense into him. White people. The neighborhood where Dr. Soleil's research institute was located was a residential one and not hard to find. Anastasia felt some foreboding as she walked down the road into it, for all the homes had high walls around them, and there were few lanes running between them. There would be few places to hide if she saw a community patrol, or worse. But she had little choice, so she pushed onward, tracking her progress on a map she had copied out on notebook paper and double-checking the directions she had copied next to it. She wanted to save her phone's battery, and so she was not using GPS. The roads were easy to navigate, and she turned a few more corners, her confidence growing, until she realized she had a much more serious problem. Anastasia had turned the last corner before the street the institute would be on, but right down the road in the middle of her path were two hunched and gruesome figures. Zombies. The closer of the two she could smell on the breeze. This was at least good news, since it meant that Anastasia was downwind. But there was nothing good about the odor. It was the stench of the grave, of a body rotting in a gutter festering in the sun. This zombie was a shambler. It had been an old woman who had likely died after a long life. Her funeral dress was moldy and ruined from groundwater and decay. Her body was falling apart in grotesque ways. She was missing an eye, and the flesh around her legs was gone, so she walked on bones wrapped in loose stockings with a Swiss cheese pattern of holes in them. Entire chunks of her face were gone, revealing her jaw and teeth and a great tongue lolling between them. Anastasia tried hard not to gag and hid herself around the corner of the nearest wall. It was the farther zombie, she knew, that posed the greater threat. This one was only recently deceased and looked to have escaped the hospital morgue, for he was dressed in a hospital gown. A toe tag flipped along the ground as he moved along the gutter, sniffing for anything to eat. His body had yet to decay, and she knew he would be able to run after her if he caught her scent. But if her estimations were correct, the zombies were right between her and Dr. Soleil's compound. She would never get past them. Anastasia crept backwards, the way she had come, and unfolded her map. The neighborhood was set up with some semblance of blocks, and she realized she could go the long way around, sneaking behind the zombies, since they were moving towards where she was hiding now and away from the address she had for Dr. Soleil. She refolded the notebook map just as something screamed behind her. She turned to see the terrible face of the old woman zombie with its yawning, ruined mouth. The thing had rounded the corner, spotted her, and started towards her. Anastasia knew the other would not be far behind. She began to sprint away. She worked out the turn she had to take in her head. Halfway down the next street, though, she looked over her shoulder to see that indeed the other zombie, his hospital gown flapping about him, was coming after her, eyes wide, mouth black and red with gore. She pushed herself to run faster, her lungs burning, the beats of her heart punching up into her throat. Her skin broke out in a cold sweat. She raced around the next corner, knowing she was taking a risk by not checking for more zombies first, but she couldn't afford to slow down. She was lucky. The street was clear. She could see the turn for Dr. Soleil's road, but she could also hear the feet of the zombie slapping on the pavement as he turned the corner after her. Anastasia had the machete, but she was more certain than ever that she didn't want to use it. There had to be another way. As she raced along the walls of compounds and locked gates, she looked up and thought of one. Many of the compounds had trees with limbs that reached over their walls. She slipped an arm out of her backpack strap, pulling it in front of her, unzipped it, and yanked out her length of rope. The zombie was closing, his legs longer than Anastasia's, but she had picked out the tree limb she needed. She came to an abrupt stop, tossed the end of the rope over, and secured the most basic of knots with the end that fell down. She made the quick and difficult decision to drop the machete before she started to climb. It just would have gotten in her way. I hope I don't come to regret that. She used her legs and feet to supplement the strength of her arms, just as she had learned to do in gym class. The runner's breathing and groaning grew louder and closer behind her. The tree branch shook as she pulled herself up, the leaves rustling and a few grape-sized yellow fruits, kumquats, dropping around her. She pushed and pulled a bit further, the top of the wall coming into view. She could just see over it into the compound. The zombie was just below her, hissing and clawing at the wall, too much of his prefrontal cortex gone for him to understand how to use the rope himself. Anastasia got her hands on the tree limb, swung her legs up, and shimmied along its length until she could balance on the wall. Her pursuer cried out in frustration, a piercing voice that warbled between a high-pitched scream and a low growl, like a hungry dog. She was, thankfully, out of his reach, as unreachable as the machete was to her, left useless on the ground next to the zombie's feet. The old lady zombie came shuffling around the corner, too, prompting Anastasia to pull the rope back up out of their reach, just in case. She turned to take in the compound and felt a rush of gratitude. After a series of disasters, at least one lucky break had come her way. This was the very compound she wanted. She double-checked the address above the door of the main building, though the sign over the door, the Saitoti Research Institute, was enough to tell her she was in the right place. The grounds were well kept with orange and avocado trees, as well as potted frangipani set at even intervals along a brick path. But there were signs that gardeners had not visited in some time. The grass was high, and the walkway was dotted with the fallen petals of the frangipani blooms. Dozens upon dozens of kumquats were scattered, uncollected on the ground. Anastasia made her way to the trunk and slid down it into the yard. The main house was a converted colonial estate, the original windows replaced by sleek, energy-efficient glass without sectioned panes. The roof was lined with solar panels, satellite dishes, and antennae. Crowded in the spaces between were weather instruments such as wind and rain gauges, lightning rods, and even barometers. She walked between the frangipani pots and stepped to the ebony door. It was carved with intricate Swahili reliefs common on the coast. To the left of the door waited a touch panel. An invisible electronic eye detected her and chimed, the screen flickering on to display a keypad and a field for a security code. Hello? Anastasia said. After a few moments, the screen cleared and a voice came out from the speaker overhead. It was a female voice, confident, if a bit distracted. "Who are you? How did you get past the gate?" "I am Anastasia Alba. I climbed over. I was running from zombies, but I was looking for the Saitoti Research Institute. I'm looking for Dr. Soleil. I know it sounds strange, but my cousin, she told me I should try to find Dr. Soleil. See, my brother was bit by a zombie because I wasn't watching him, and my cousin, people say she can talk to spirits, and I think they told her that I should come here and that somehow Dr. Soleil is the key to finding a way to fix the outbreak." Anastasia knew she was rambling. She had not really prepared her story, and the adrenaline rush of the chase was still in her, making her speak at a breathless pace. She surely sounded like a foolish girl, maybe a bit crazy. But these were crazy times, and perhaps the unprepared nature of her story would lend her some believability. Anastasia paused, taking out a handkerchief and wiping her face and neck. Just as she stuffed it into her pocket again, the door opened. The woman on the other side was older than she, but still young. She looked like a graduate student, her hair in a gray wrap and wearing a white lab coat and a stylish pair of white-framed glasses that were a striking contrast to her dark complexion. The young woman took in Anastasia, her eyes looking up and down the length of her body, studying her sweaty, disheveled appearance, her full backpack, and her still heaving chest. The woman's eyes glanced out at the yard as if to confirm Anastasia was unaccompanied. She lifted herself onto the balls of her feet as she looked out, her movements smooth and poised, as if she were a professional dancer or had grown up balanced on the upper branches of a tree. It lent her an almost royal air. "You came alone?" she asked. "Yes. Please come in. I'm Dr. Latia Soleil." The interior of the building bore all the signs of having been converted and upgraded to a state-of-the-art scientific laboratory, but just what branch of science, Anastasia was not sure. They passed through a room full of 2-, 4-, and 6-legged machines that was clearly a robotics lab. Across the way was a chemistry laboratory with the standard glassware of graduated cylinders, beakers, and flasks. Gas extraction and sublimation apparatuses sat beneath dust covers. Against the walls were incubators, a fume hood, and an autoclave. The entire room hummed with the noise of a refrigeration unit in the corner. A third room's ceiling extended upwards 3 stories to allow space for the enormous bulk of an astronomy telescope. It ended just short of the domed aperture in the roof, presently closed. Anastasia's head was on a swivel as she followed Dr. Soleil up the staircase, the original polished wood steps and banister still intact. On the second floor, they turned down a long corridor, passing by spaces that looked like student lounges with kitchenettes, whiteboards, and signs on the walls displaying the keys to the secured wireless network. Even though the building was designed to accommodate many teams of researchers, as far as Anastasia could see, Dr. Soleil was all alone. The doctor led her next into a series of rooms at the south end of the building. Here, Anastasia's assumption that this was only a scientific institute fell apart completely as they walked through rooms now lined with bookcases of old books, scroll fragments displayed in glass cases, as well as drawer after drawer of archaeological artifacts. The next room was even more unexpected, as it was full of religious artifacts from around the world, talismans, statues, masks, and elaborately decorated headdresses. It was disorienting, like running through a museum without reading any of the signs. Artifacts from historical and geological epochs, relics of dozens and dozens of cultures and belief systems going by in a blur. They went through a final corridor where a row of windows facing the front of the house let light fall on a wall filled with plaques and paintings. Anastasia noticed a saying from Albert Einstein that read, "If you want your children to be intelligent, read them fairy tales." Another beside it read, "Uncertainty is the starting point of a story, possibility the end." But she didn't recognize the name Jangwa to whom it was attributed, nor did she recognize the name Father Richard Rohr to whom the next saying was ascribed. The problem is no longer to believe in God, it is to believe in humanity. She was equally unfamiliar with the name Peter Berger and the injunction next to his name. See the general in the particular and the strange in the familiar. The last bit of the wall had stylized African prints of a woman, perhaps even a goddess, in a swirl of burgundy robes, bedecked with sapphire earrings and a necklace. She had piercing eyes and was walking on the steaming waters of a pool within a cave of ice. Across from the painting was a red and black wooden mask. It was hideous, with a screeching mouth, jagged fangs, and eyes of bottomless darkness. Anastasia felt a chill as she walked past it. They finally stopped in a room that appeared to be Dr. Soleil's study. Books from the sciences, physics, medicine, biology, were shelved next to texts on religion, folk tales, and myths, many with cracked and peeling spines. Dr. Soleil's desk, however, was state-of-the-art, with a new laptop docked and feeding into 3 display screens and 3 keyboards, one in Arabic, one with the Roman alphabet, and a third with Mandarin characters. "Sit down, please. Let me make us some chai," Dr. Soleil said. Anastasia waited, studying the frames hung on the wall to her left. The degrees were less interesting than the photographs. She got up from her seat to take a closer look. The pictures had been taken in a village, perhaps Dr. Soleil's home. The buildings in the background were rustic, made of clay with either thatch or tile roofs. The most prominent one was a red schoolhouse. A sign over its door read, "Mti Waanga Academy, where the young can reach for new heights." Dr. Soleil and a handsome young man in an apricot-colored dashiki stood side by side, cutting a ribbon before the school. The next picture had Dr. Soleil and the same young man again, cutting a second ribbon, this time with some other members of the village in front of an even larger building with the name Cirrus Secondary. The third had an even larger crowd gathered around Dr. Soleil and the young man again as they cut a third ribbon before the doors of Ndoto Hutimizwa University. The bystanders changed, as did Dr. Soleil's hairstyles, but she and the young man were constant, as was the look of genuine enthusiasm, even affection that the man with the preference for apricot dashikis wore as he looked at Dr. Soleil in each picture. Dr. Soleil returned with a tea tray. Anastasia turned and rushed back to her seat, feeling as if she had been caught snooping. Dr. Soleil did not seem to mind. She sat down, not behind her desk, but in the other chair alongside, so that she could sit next to Anastasia. "You must be brave, stupid, or desperate to come out here alone. They say the perimeter is being breached everywhere," she said, sipping her chai. "Possibly all three? That goes for all of us these days, doesn't it?" "Yes." Anastasia had launched into her story without restraint earlier. That had gotten her in the door, but she had no idea who this woman was, aside from the fact that she was very learned. She didn't want to be rude and ask too many questions too soon, so Anastasia started with, "What is this place?" "The Saitoti Research Institute. It's named after my father. He was chief of my village when I was growing up." "Is that where the pictures are from?" "Yes," Dr. Soleil said, blowing on her chai to cool it. "Those were from the inauguration of different schools. They were the dream of my friend." Anastasia noted the slightest of pauses before the word friend. Dr. Soleil, who had shown no timidity to meet her gaze up to now, looked away. She stared for a long, wordless moment at the pictures. Anastasia wondered if Dr. Soleil missed her home, or maybe her friend. She sensed there was more story there, but it wasn't her business. She needed this woman to help her, and Anastasia had appeared uninvited on her doorstep. She was not about to be nosy or presumptuous. Instead, she nodded to the diplomas on the wall. "My cousin told me you had lots of degrees, but I never guessed so many. How do you find the time?" Dr. Soleil sipped her chai again. "Why sleep when you can read?" Anastasia realized her parents probably would have wished she were as excited about studying. "This cousin of yours, she had a dream that led you here? Tell me more." Anastasia told Dr. Soleil her story in greater detail, including the family legends about Jambi, her mysterious journey to Mount Caliente, as she thought it might explain why Anastasia had listened to Jambi in the first place and risked her life on the streets on the mere hint of a dream. Dr. Soleil listened without judgment. If anything, she appeared interested, making curious, and even saying, "Interesting," at times. When Anastasia finished relating what had happened with her brother the day before, her chai had gone cold. Dr. Soleil had finished hers and replaced it on her lap with the notebook, where she jotted down a few thoughts before she put the pen between her teeth and furrowed her brow. Anastasia waited, swallowing. When Dr. Soleil said nothing, the long silence becoming uncomfortable, Anastasia asked, "Do you have any idea why Jambi would send me to you, Dr. Soleil?" "Please, call me Latia." "Okay, Latia, so what do you think this is all about?" Dr. Soleil, Latia, answered with a question. "Do you believe in ghosts, Anastasia?" Her mother, whenever Anastasia had been scared at night, had always told her there were no such things as ghosts. But in church, they talked about souls and spirits. Jesus had cast out demons, and the priest often invoked the Holy Ghost. If all those things were real, maybe ghosts were real? Anastasia was not sure whether to believe her mother or the church ladies and priests. "Well, recently we've seen that zombies are a thing, so maybe anything is possible. I don't know." "Admitting ignorance prepares the soil for the seed of wisdom, or so the saying goes," Latia said. Standing, she walked over to the doorway they had first entered the office through and waved at Anastasia to follow. They retraced their steps through the house while Latia spoke. "I think this all has to do with zombies, ghosts, and story." "Okay," Anastasia said, following behind Latia, if not following what she said. But Latia continued as they passed, again through the artifact room, into the hall, and back towards the stairs. "We all have bodies, Anastasia. Science tells us this. We have souls, too. We know this from tradition, folk tales, and theology. But it's when our souls become separated from our bodies that we can get into trouble. Normally, the separation is easy. Bodies are left behind to sleep in the earth and become one with the next cycle of life, and the soul becomes spirit. And the spirit goes on to the afterlife, whatever that looks like." Anastasia followed Latia down the staircase. "You mean heaven?" "It could be heaven. It could be like Tien, Valhalla, Jana, Svargaloka, or the Summerland. Maybe you are reincarnated, maybe you join the ancestors. If there is one thing we have learned from quantum field theory, it's that, in some sense, all possibilities exist simultaneously. Our illusion of absolute certainty of binaries, this notion that reality is one thing that we observe but not the other, is an emergent phenomenon of our existence on a plane of reality governed by classical notions of gravity and relativity. At the quantum level, it's just the opposite. I'm so confused, Anastasia said, as they reached the bottom of the steps, Latia turning and leading them into the chemistry lab. She went to the refrigeration unit and placed her palm on a security reader. A computerized female voice recognized her with a, "Welcome back, Dr. Soleil," as she opened the sealed door. Latia took a steel canister out of a case locked inside the fridge. Canister in hand, Dr. Soleil led the way back upstairs. Anastasia scrambled to follow. Don't worry about the many worlds hypothesis just now. What you need to know is that if our spirits get lost, that is when they become ghosts. When you are a ghost, it means you have forgotten your most important truths, your notions of who you are. And if you are a ghost, your body becomes restless. So when you are a ghost, what is left behind becomes a zombie, Anastasia said, running up the stairs alongside Latia. Exactly. So we just need to reunite the ghosts with their bodies, and the zombie problem is solved? You're getting there, but it's a little more complicated, Latia said, leading them back to her office. See, the ghosts have lost something, forgotten it, really. You said they forgot their truths, who they are. Right. They have forgotten their stories. Forget leptons, quarks, and bosons. The most fundamental element of the spirit realm is not physical, but metaphysical. It is the story, our narrative with a beginning, middle, and end, resolution and identity being the emergent phenomenon from these pieces, just like atoms, molecules, and elements are emergent in the material world. And they, in turn, come together to make everything from teacups to particle accelerators. Anastasia was pretty certain she was lost again. They made their way through the series of rooms and hallways back to Latia's office, where she sat down in her seat across from her desk again. Anastasia took her place next to her. This time, Latia's stare was intense and penetrating. And if you don't know your story, Anastasia, you don't know the most important truths in the universe. The truth, Anastasia repeated. She thought of the church ladies and priests telling her how Jesus was the way, the truth, the light, or her Muslim friends explaining to her that the Quran was truth, even courtroom dramas on television where witnesses swore to tell the truth and nothing but the truth. But what truth, little t or big T, was Latia talking about? Anastasia had no clue. Latia read her confusion. It's a conclusion I only came to realize after studies across many subjects. I first saw it in the scientific world. In molecular biology, it is evident in the cycle of life. Birth, life, death, then rebirth. Regeneration, then life, death, and so on. In general biology, it's obvious in the process of evolution. In particle physics, it's in the laws of thermodynamics. I saw it at the grandest of scales in astrophysics, in the violent supernovae deaths of stars and how that spreads the material for life throughout the universe. Anastasia, do you realize that every atom in your body, every element from the hydrogen and oxygen in your blood to the iron, potassium, calcium, all those minerals and micronutrients, they all were fused in the heart of dying stars moments before they exploded? Anastasia was not sure how to respond or if she was even tracking along with all that Latia was saying, but Dr. Soleil had the degrees, ran a research institute, and Jambi had sent Anastasia to her, so she was inclined to trust her. No, I had not realized that," Latia continued, apparently not discouraged by Anastasia's ignorance. "After that, I turned to the qualitative disciplines. I saw it everywhere, ethics, metaphysics, and epistemology. The same pattern emerges in theology and history, not to mention literature and poetry. I saw fragments of the same truth everywhere I looked. After all this time, I can boil it down to this. It all comes down to the power of story. Specifically, the redemptive story. Redemptive story, Anastasia repeated, thinking she was starting to understand. This sounded a bit like Sunday school class or a teaser for a drama on television. I'm not talking about Jesus, Latia said, as if sensing just what Anastasia had been assuming. Oh. Although Jesus is sort of the Christian version of this story, she added. But that is just one lens, one possibility existing among the many. Okay, Anastasia said, twisting one of her braids. Latia leaned forward, her eyes sympathetic, as if she knew she was overwhelming Anastasia's 13-year-old brain. It's like this. The redemptive story is the notion that we need transformation stories. We need stories wherein the bad is redeemed by its ultimate good, by someone rising above their suffering. We need to see how others learn lessons from their travails, to become better people than before. It's the idea that what you lose, what you suffer, can become a doorway to something better.